Hello, happy holidays. This video is going to talk about Worlds, some of my experiences at Worlds, and advice that has generally helped me. I am sorry for not having uploaded recently. Between work and studying, it's been a bit difficult. Also, no PowerPoint for this one because I didn't have time, but also I wanted this to be a bit more personal as well. Not really in an emotional sense, but more of in recognition that these are my experiences that might not reflect everyone's experiences at Worlds. But I hope that what has worked for me in the past, at least some of it, can translate the making sure that it could possibly work for other people. I think results and World's performance are heavily impacted by randomness, by positions, judges, motions, etc. However, I do think that what I can provide as advice is more so controlling that randomness as opposed to um, throwing advice out there that might not work in some situations. So I'm gonna talk about things that have worked for me in three like large aspects. First is just pure debating, strategy, all that kind of stuff. Second is logistics, a very short section on that. And third, just mental. What has my attitude been like at Worlds and how that has helped me give fairly consistent performances. I think one thing that somewhat qualifies me, I guess, to provide this advice is more than my results and performance, it's that I came into Worlds with very different expectations of both myself and from other people. In 2020, I my team was able to make the quarter, and I would say that year we weren't a very well known team, one that I don't think was one of the names you'd expect in that quarter. We had done quite a bit in our local and like regional circuit, but I would say especially in America or Europe, we at least were able to make it to Australs. We weren't a very well known team. In 2021, while I would say we were starting to perform fairly well in some of the tournaments leading up to Worlds that year in Korea or online in Korea, um, I don't think we were necessarily like a finals like favorite at least. I think it wasn't I hope it wasn't a long shot, but at the same time I wouldn't say it was like good betting odds on us either. And finally, at Belgrade, we had much greater expectations. I think there was a bit more pressure for us to do well again that Worlds, and finally culminated in Madrid with David and Toby winning Worlds. So I think more than anything, the message I want to impart is that number one, it doesn't matter what the expectations are. Hopefully, this advice helps you. But regardless of that, the breaking at Worlds, getting far at Worlds, everything that's come before may have an effect. I'm not going to deny that, but it's also not set in stone. So if you're not breaking in some pre-world tournaments, if you're afraid of your performances leading up to Worlds, uh, leave all that behind. It's just Worlds, and that's all that matters now. Similarly, there are teams that are going to win a bunch of pre-world tournaments that are going to kill it and might not live up to those expectations. And that isn't to say that we should be disappointed in them, but if you're one of those teams, don't take your foot off the gas pedal. Continue to prepare. Keep the same things that have been working for you um, into the tournament. So debating. I'm gonna start with motions and what to expect. I think the obvious one is read up on for this year Vietnam, but generally the host city, as well as the region that it's from. So ASEAN, Southeast Asia in general. I would say that this is fairly obvious and will always be a reliable thing. But I think the second thing that is less obvious is there tends to be a matter heavy motion that I would argue isn't very topical in the sense that it's not at the top of the news cycle. It's not something that you are hearing over and over again throughout the year, but it's more of like a constant recurring issue that it would help to be very well informed about. And it's somewhat far from the host city. So, for example, at Thailand Worlds, there was the motion about Mexican drug cartels. At Korea Worlds, there was a motion about Russian Arctic exploration. And a bit more at the top of the headlines, but also at Madrid Worlds, there was a motion about Taiwan. And so basically, there tend to be these motions that are just not where the city at Worlds is, but at the same time, you're not going to be prepared just by reading the headline articles. I think these are often tests of how loaded a team is. And you want to make sure that you've covered a fairly broad base such that you can at least give a case you are somewhat confident in should these rounds come up. I think what else to expect in terms of motions is that a lot of motions tend to be very classic with like a new spin or twist that the Edge core puts in. So a good example of that I think is the Thailand Worlds motion about eliminating all tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. And this is a very common debate about free trade, whether or not it's good or bad. But I think the new spin here, at least for Worlds, is rapid and the complete elimination of all these barriers. So it's not about some kind of middle ground form of free trade. It is the absolute maximum extent, unfettered capitalism kind of thing going on. And so, what I'd say about these classic motions is that number one, almost everyone at Worlds knows how to debate them to a degree. And you should be making cases that assume that already. And what you'd want to spend most of your prep time on is the new twist, the novel thing about the motion. And it's not just something taken to a greater extreme. It could also be a classic motion with a relatively new mechanism or something of the sort, right? And you want to focus on what makes this motion new. Because if you are on opening, you want to take away points of extension from closing. And if you are on closing, you are going to have a free point of extension. Mostly because I think when people hit these kinds of motions, there's a tendency to kind of go back to canned cases, thinking to your partner, we've done this motion before, we've won in this motion before, we just should be doing relatively similar things to what we have done in the past. Whereas the whole point of this is to have this new and novel twist to it so that it's a more fun and exciting debate, right? At the same time, granting some degree of stability in the case that it's a bubble round or one of the final prelims, and therefore is very appealing to edge cores that want to reduce the randomness, the lack of reliability of motions, just in case when the rounds matter most. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I think motion diversity is often associated with topical diversity. Are you covering a wide range of motion themes, right? So religion, environment, social movement, etc. But not so much what are you being asked to do in the debate, which I think edge cores are actually very attentive to, very particular with, and knowing that they're all, looking at the wordings of all the motions one by one, are likely to be very careful about what they're asking debaters to do. Meaning then, you will also have strategic diversity in terms of, are you comparing two things? Are you going to have to ask debaters to go somewhere very different from status quo and defend this radical change from status quo? Are you asking them to compare two different mechanisms to achieve a very similar goal, right? And so from the debater's like strategic perspective, you don't want to just be confident in all the different things that you could talk about. You want to be confident in all the possible motion types. Firstly, just the rules of those motion types you should know by heart. But secondly, the different strategic variations of those motion types and how you go about them at opening or closing, you should also know very well. Meaning then, if you're comparing two different things, what are the different issues you could create? How do you make those comparisons? How do you sell that over an opening team that has spammed a lot of different things, right? Given that, I think you also have to be very careful about the particular words being chosen in the motion. The smallest adjectives, adverbs, the modifying clauses, or whatever. I think those become really important, especially when it comes to being very nuanced in debates and trying to tell other teams you are the most nuanced team. So, in terms of motions, be very careful with whatever is thrown at you and prepare well with the different types of diversity that edge course might throw at you. For feedback, I think generally, obviously, you want to get feedback, I'm not gonna like give you obvious advice there. My main feedback or advice here on feedback is I think you have to know when not to take feedback. And that isn't to say you don't ask the judge for feedback, but more of you want to look at every piece of feedback with a more critical lens. And you want to balance that with like not being stubborn. Because I'm not telling you right now that you shouldn't be a self aware debater and that you don't have room for improvement. I think all throughout my debating career, no matter how well I had been doing, there was always something about my speeches that could have been fixed. However, I think being very keen on details, the types of data that should be representative, you have to be very self aware of. What do I mean by that? The first thing is you have to know when to just take the L on some feedbacks. Meaning, you have to know when you know you could have fixed it, but given the situation and circumstances you were in, it might not have been very strategic to fix it if you were to give up something else. What's an example of that? I spoke a lot of deputy, and I would hope to think I was a fairly clear, easy to follow speaker. And that was kind of a crutch for me because I would also not really outline my speeches at the start, not tell you what to expect in terms of my contribution, especially at deputy in comparison to member. But I also recognize that speaking deputy is really hard because a lot of material in prep will go to first speaker, and you're going to come into the prep room not having very much on your paper, but obviously also having to say many substantive things in 7 minutes. What that would entail for me is I would give up some of the larger structure, meaning the clear division of what's going to happen in my speech. Not the cleanest at deputy, admittedly, but I knew that within individual arguments, individual responses, it wouldn't be hard to understand what I was getting at and what the purpose of what I was getting at was. And within like the 7 minute LO speech, sometimes I have no speech at the start of it and all of my speech at the end of it. It's really difficult to structure and organize everything. And at the same time, have to come up with key rebuttals to the LO speaker. What I do then is kind of ignore it. Like, I would know that I could have organized my speech better, but at the same time, that having taken the time and effort to organize my speech might not have been worth losing substantive responses in rebuttal. And therefore, I knew judges were going to tell me you could organize this better. And that's fair. Like, if I were judging myself, I would have probably given the same point of feedback. That said, I recognize that there were some rounds where I just had absolutely nothing. And taking the time to organize things would have taken away important material for me to generate and write down. So, some feedback, you just take the L on. Yes, you could have improved it. Under better circumstances, maybe you should. But given what happened in the round, maybe it wouldn't have been the best idea. Because otherwise, like the counterfactual, I guess, is the judge would have told you that you didn't rebut X claim or that you should have provided material on Y. And that would have been the feedback instead. And that's maybe the feedback you should have acted on in that other world. Second, know when you're making too many adjustments. And again, you don't want to be stubborn. You don't want to think you have no room for improvement. But I think there are many instances where debaters might make relatively large changes to the way they speak or how they approach debates when in future rounds they might not be correct. Or even if they are correct, they introduce a whole slew of new problems. And especially when you're already at the tournament, maybe it would have been good if you had workshopped something for like 3 weeks or a month. But at the tournament, you have what you have, and you don't have that kind of time. So, for example, in my first worlds, my partner and I had very set positions at opening. I would speak first, he would speak second, but we were very flexible on closing. Uh, we adjusted a bit too much on closing, I think. I would sometimes whip, I would sometimes remember, he would sometimes whip, he would sometimes remember. And whenever we were swapping as often as we did, it was very hard for us to try and pin down what could we have worked on, who should extend in what circumstances. And it was introducing a whole like slew of different things we had to work around. And instead we just committed. Like I'll remember he whips. And that had its own flaws because we both had different strengths at member and at whip. But at the same time, it controlled the degree to which we would have to figure out all those different things. Because instead, I could just focus on what could I do better at member, and he would just have to focus on what could he do better at whip. And not specifically for just speaker roles, but when you make more adjustments, you're also introducing the possibility of new issues and problems. So you have to be very careful. And I'm not saying, again, don't adjust anything. What I am saying is you have to understand what can possibly happen when you make these changes. And is it something that you can reasonably fix within the course of the tournament? Because if not, I don't think it might be worth it. Last thing, I think you have to know when feedback is round specific because judges don't have a very good or very representative view of how you debate because sometimes a judge might tell you that you a prime minister might not be very good at setting up or that your arguments are unclear, etc. And you go into the next round thinking, I have to be more clear, I have to pay more attention to XYZ, when really the problem was you didn't know much about the motion, which obviously is unfortunate. But at the same time, maybe it was just a very specific matter heavy motion that come the next round where you actually know more things, it won't be as big a problem. And therefore, the feedback that the judge might have given you was accurate for the point in time in which they had seen you debate, but will not be particularly helpful for the future. Knowing that, then, you have to ask yourself what are the circumstances that led to the different points of feedback I have in this round? Are they things that are recurring, that are likely to repeat? Or are they things that I can chalk up to a bad round and just know I'll do better next time? Because you also don't want to tunnel on the different points of feedback and then have a round with very different circumstances punish you for not having done other things. For example, if you are told that you have to prove um, some more things, then maybe the case you had in the round was just one with a particularly high burden of proof. You had to explain a lot of things, you had to show why a lot of things were true in order for your extension to work, for example. But in the next round, you come into the round with a case that is fairly intuitive, isn't very difficult to believe, and therefore you have to spend more time maybe positioning and framing the argument. The previous feedback that you incorporate would have told you you should prove it more instead, and then you do a more unstrategic thing. So, main point here is feedback is good, it's very helpful, but you also cannot be uncritical about that feedback and make sure that you assess everything that's being told to you. Know when to apply it and when not to. Third, what makes Worlds different from other tournaments is just the variation in circuits and variation in debating norms between circuits. So, for example, I think especially when before online tournaments, I had very limited exposure, like probably none, debating in the U.S. and Europe. And one thing that I was adjusting to a lot from the Asian circuit is comparatives and just how to do them because I wouldn't say we were an uncomparative circuit, and the circuit has grown a lot since I've been debating. But what I would say is I could leave a lot more to be assumed uh, when I was debating locally. Meaning, if I say X happens in this world, it's kind of assumed what would happen in the counterfactual, which I think was exploited significantly when other debaters would rebut me and say, that's an uncomparative argument. Actually, what happens in the counterfactual is the complete opposite of what they're saying. And so, this is just my experience. I'm not sure if that's true everywhere else. But what I will say is you have to understand not only what the differences are in like a tournament that has so many different circuits in the world and how they practice debating, but you also have to understand why those norms and practices are valuable. So, for example, for the comparative, right? I don't think it's sufficient if you were debating me before and just saying uncomparative speaker or they don't address the counterfactual or something like that. Um, yeah, sure, right? Like that could and was probably true back then. Um, but it's not going to be very useful for a judge unless you explain here are the things that likely would have happened in the counterfactual, and here's why them being uncomparative is actually detrimental to the case. Maybe they bring up harms that in like their world lead to even greater harms in comparison, right? So explaining that and ensuring that we are just pointing out here are differences in how we are debating. You're pointing out here are importances as to why those differences matter and why you have to do XYZ thing to make a more disciplined argument is an important thing to do as well. Second, to pick up on these if you can, like spar with other teams in hotel rooms right before the tournament. But I would also say another substitute for that is just to watch debating and to watch debating on like there's so many resources nowadays on YouTube and everywhere. It's quite accessible. Um, and generally it would be helpful to understand what debating is like. I think the nice thing about Worlds, from my experience again, is that I've not only encountered many different circuits, but also that whenever I've been judged, I've, for most of the time, have been judged by panels that are both gender balanced and have been fairly regionally diverse. And I think that helps in ensuring that any particular biases towards one style of debating or one way circuits debate over another way are generally corrected. And those attempts to try and bridge those differences then become much more valuable in panel discussions when one judge has to explain why you want to debate. Very important thing, next thing, is to debate with the assumption of trust. And what I mean by that is Worlds is very tough, right? Like you have some of the best debaters in the world, some of the best judges in the world, and you have to think that you and your teammate are in that category of some of the best debaters in the world. No matter how delusional it might feel at sometimes, you really have to. So, when debating with the assumption of trust, I mean that in different ways. First is you have to trust your opponents, meaning you're very rarely going to have free extensions, right? Like they're going to come up with compelling cases. They're going to come up with good faith rebuttals to your case. They're going to find ways to exploit mistakes you might make. Which means that in prep time, you cannot be satisfied with a case and assume that you will be left with an extension no matter how genius you think it is. You cannot be satisfied with a case if you know there is a giant hole that, if pointed out and exploited, could lose you the debate, because very likely it will be. And you cannot be satisfied with a round where all you do is have this back and forth about whether or not something is true or calling each other unengaging when actually both of you are unengaging. Because a lot of the time, other teams will actually be fairly engaging, will be very good at flipping material. And therefore, knowing that and assuming that will push you to debate better. I think for better or for worse, I'm someone who generally debates to the level of my opponents. And I think that's what helps me a lot in Worlds because I like debating against tough competition and I do better when debating against tough competition. And that's something that you have to think about every step of the way. Second, trust judges. I know this can be tough sometimes, but it generally helps actually because you will have some of the best judges in the world. Everybody at Worlds really, really wants to break, right? And so they're not going to be lazy and not listen to you. A lot of the extreme descriptions I've heard of judges about just completely ignoring arguments, etc., are oftentimes things that are just they're not able to share in the OA or they aren't able to perfectly communicate to you within their speech, but at the same time, you aren't able to perfectly communicate everything in your speech either. In essence, I just do think judges generally do quite a good job, no matter how cynical debating might make someone. Um, but doing that, I feel like, is actually quite good for your debating because there are many times in which I've heard fairly unstrategic things because they don't trust judges. What are some examples? I think one, I've heard very good extensions be repeated almost completely by whips because they are clarified, because they need to point out what the logic of the extension was. Whereas if I'm judging and you have a good member speaker, like I get it. Like I know what your extension is. You don't have to tell me again. Spend that time weighing the extension, performing like important rebuttal, rather than just trying to explain to me what the extension is. Of course, if you feel like the extension could use some clarifying, that's helpful. But if the source of that is just you don't think I got it, because I don't know, like I made a face or something like that, um, not going to be very helpful, right? So I think things like that, or I don't know, like when one speaker uses some kind of appeal to emotion, or like appeal to identity, I've seen a lot of other debaters respond to these by just telling me not to buy it, when obviously I would have to weigh their arguments on the merit of how well they create those arguments, regardless of whether or not you tell me that, because I am a judge. And so all of those things, I feel like, need to always assume good judging. And oftentimes that will help you do better at Worlds when you have that assumption. Last thing, you have to trust your teammate. And obviously, people aren't perfect. The people you work with won't be perfect. I have not been a perfect teammate. But again, there are things that only one of the two of you can do. For example, at closing, only one of you can give an extension. At opening, only one of you will be able to set up, only one of you can give the policy. What that entails is you have to maximize the allowable opportunities for you in your position rather than try and be redundant. For example, there have been times where I, at member, no, I will not be able to fully rebut things that have come out from opening or the opposite member. But I have a lot of extension material that has to come out that my whip cannot say. And therefore, I just need to have faith that they will give good rebuttals to the opposing team, right? And I think it's difficult because at times you will come up with clever ideas and you have to trust someone else to say them. Or you will come up with clever rebuttal that you do not know if they will say or value in your communication with one another. That will happen, but I will say more often than not, optimizing for what is allowable within your position is going to win you more than debates than trying to do everything on your own. I have had many rounds where the exchanges were won at whip precisely because I knew at member I had to give the extension, and my whip had the room and the space to weigh the argument, to rebut the argument, and to do it well, which they did. Been very lucky to have good whips in like both my partnerships as well. And so you want to ensure you're optimizing all this, and that comes first and foremost from a sense of trust with your teammate. Last thing is breakgrounds and how they might change. The simplest thing I can say here is you do not want to give an easy reason for you to lose. Like you want any explanation of your team losing to be fairly complicated. And I'm not saying use some like trickery here, but do not make obvious mistakes. And I think those obvious mistakes come from tunnel vision, a lack of discipline, losing the basics and fundamentals of debating before coming into a round. So that looks like being derivative, not having a comparative, not considering an important point that all the other teams have considered. All of that you have to be very sharp on because you are debating some of the best teams in the world because they have broken at Worlds. And you want to avoid any possibility of that happening. There will be times where one of you will have to save it, i.e., PM makes some kind of error, Elo points it out. At DPM, you don't just deny it, right? Like you have to save the case. And sometimes saving the case will be like the only shot you have at winning that break round and advancing. You have to be up for that challenge and be like willing to win that. Second is you just have to be very sharp on round dynamics, meaning you need to know what claims depend on other claims. You have to know what claims respond to other claims. You have to know which speaker said what. All those different things, because explaining those round dynamics in a way that is cohesive and easy to understand is often how you get a panel to vote for you, because you had the best understanding of how everything worked and positioned your case around all those different things. All right, that's it for debating. 30 minutes, but that's fine. Second, on logistics. Two things. The first is you don't want to waste your time on logistics. Like the nice thing about online debating for me was I was in this room doing most of my debates and knew where everything was. The hard thing about having done Worlds on site was finding everything and getting lost, spending and wasting a lot of time in prep looking for a corner where other people are not. You have to sort all that out. Like, do it whenever you can. know where the venues generally are, like maybe not every room, but buildings and stuff like that, and find a constant place to prep if that might help you. Because I know some people like to prep inside the room, but then end up being near teams that are going to extend off them and therefore having to move, all those different types of things. So it helps to just like have like a dedicated corner in the like university or wherever it is, just to make sure you can prep comfortably in peace and actually spend those 15 minutes doing like debating and not finding stuff. Second, uh, like Worlds is, in as much as it's a marathon of 9 rounds, 3 days is not a lot of time, and it's hard to think that those 3 days will perfectly capture the fullness of your debating skill. Because at the end of it, a lot of it will come down to just on the day performance. And things like whether or not your like head feels a bit hazy that day, things like not being very focused, things like having difficulty thinking about things and wrapping your head around things than you normally do, can cost you crucial rounds. I think you have to make sure you are keenly aware of what you need, how to feel at your utmost comfort, and particularly paying attention to your body and just also taking care of your partner as well, because it's hard to notice these things about ourselves sometimes. At my first Worlds, I spent the entire break day. You don't have to do this, obviously, but I was exhausted and I slept until like 6 p.m. That helped my performance a lot, just because Worlds is tiring, and making sure that I was on my A game on the break rounds was only really possible because I got that rest. So take care of yourself, have like proper nutrition, sleep, all those different things. Pay attention to. All right. Last section is just the mental stuff. What makes Worlds special in a bad way is the three silent rounds. Regardless of the merits of this, like I don't want to get into the debate of whether or not it's good or bad to have three silent rounds. It doesn't feel good for me as a debater. And you want to make sure that the stress and anxiety you feel, especially come round seven, or round eight rather, round nine, where you've already had silent rounds where you have no idea what the result is, are things you know how to deal with. So, first, like you have to understand what you need. I'm the type of person who does not want anything to do with the previous rounds. Other people would instead prefer some degree of comfort or affirmation about the previous rounds. And so it depends on you, but just pick and choose people or things to do that are likely to provide that comfort. Some people love talking about cases, like what they ran, what other people ran, and just having more confidence in that you ran like a decent case, right? Some people like forgetting I'm that type. I played Pokemon and like Smash in between like the final day of prelims. If you need something like that, be prepared for it, because you can have a lot of time where it's just you and your thoughts. Like you want to be very careful about how you direct how your head thinks on that day. So yeah. Second is you want to know how to take thirds and fourths, because thirds and fourths suck. But the thing about Worlds is that oftentimes many runs are runs of streaks, meaning sometimes people will need 8 or 9 points on the final day of Worlds, and then they will get it. Sometimes people will need 1 point on the final day, and they will not get it. You need to avoid the snowball when you start losing. Like, you want to make sure every fourth is followed up with a first or second. The way I personally do that is, again, assessing whether or not the mistakes I made when I lose are things that are recurring, and feeling like I'm in control of those mistakes. For example, I lost, I took a fourth in Worlds 2020 that had to do with, in my opinion, a fairly shallow motion and being put in a bad spot. Obviously, still my fault. I could have done something about being in that bad spot. But also, I recognize that I probably will not be in as bad a spot come the next round, and I'm more than capable of taking a first or a second. Rather than thinking, I'm such a bad debater, it's impossible for me to try and get another first after that fourth, I blew my shot. These are all thoughts that are going to cause me to actually lose the next round. and live up to what I think about myself. What helps me is to remember myself at my best, especially if these are speaker positions that you're going to be speaking in the future. So, for example, if you know you're speaking CG next round, right, and you killed it at MG or GovWhip in round two, and next round is round seven, think about that speech, know and remember, instead of your last round, your peaks. How capable, or rather, how good can you possibly be? What is the highest possible speech you're capable of? And trying to like emanate that again. I think coming from that, it's a lot easier to feel more confident coming into these rounds and putting wins together, but also making sure that you're not putting losses together as well and breaking those slumps and streaks. Last thing, helps me a lot when you're in these like difficult moments. You want to look forward to debating, and I don't mean like, I think debating is pressure. It's very stressful, and that comes from thinking of debating as representing your country, representing your university, as a sign of your intelligence or the result, the break, your CV, your legacy, or whatever people care about in debating, right? I think for me, I do my best debating when I like don't care about any of that, and I've learned not to really care that much about all that because I really enjoy debating. Like I really love giving extension speeches. I love coming up with a rebuttal that flips arguments. I love coming up with a clever case when I'm in a bad position. All of those things really, really like excite me and make me have fun debating. And that's not gonna be the same for you. You probably have different things you enjoy about debating, but you always want to go back to them. What is it about the activity in specific, not the community, not the things around debating, but just debating that you love the most? And thinking about that coming into the rounds at Worlds, they will help you do really well and they will ensure that you break any cold spells you're coming into. That's all. Thank you so much for listening and best of luck at Worlds.